Hello, ladies. Nice to see you again in this virtual world that we're living in at the moment. Today's presentation, which you will be covering during period 3, is to do with business regulation, as you can see. Okay, so this is still to do with market power and market failure, and it's your theme in your theme 4 booklet, chapter 7, and it's starting on page 35. Okay, so a little activity for you to have a little think about first and foremost. Okay, this is to do with privatisation, which I think you will have covered, and if we haven't covered it, then obviously we'll do that, and I think I do cover it in this presentation anyway. But can you do a little bit of research for me and put these examples of privatisation in the order, in the chronological order that they took place? Sounds like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, doesn't it? Unfortunately, it's no big prizes. However, in this instance, then I want you to take a look at, and might need to do a little bit of research, British Gas, water companies, Northern Rock, and each one of the other ones, and see if you can suss out when they happened. And in the process of your research, it will probably be quite interesting for you to take a look at some of the reasons why you think they might have been privatised, and we'll cover some of that in a minute. Now, we talked previously in chapter 6 about the issues of market failure, and also whether the free market was actually going to allocate resources in the correct fashion. And part of the reason for business regulation is where, in some instances, where maybe the free market isn't doing things in a proper way, then maybe some sort of business regulation might help. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a range of options as far as this is concerned. Okay, relatively short PowerPoint, and hopefully it will make a reasonable amount of sense. So first and foremost, then we're going to look at the following items. And I'm going to move myself up here for a moment so that I'm out of the way. So there we go. And so in this case, we're going to take a look at how business regulation might be used to promote competition. Okay, and that can be through a range of things. So in some cases, businesses can be regulated if they are about to or in the process of engaging in what are known as anti-competitive practices. Okay, so if it's not in the interest of the consumer, in some cases competition might be brought in to try to actually address some of the issues that might be faced. Other things that the government can do is to control mergers and takeovers. So again, if they're not in the public interest, they might actually come in and say, not happening. Sainsbury's and Asda is a perfect example, which we've obviously talked about before. They might also introduce privatisation, so the process of taking publicly owned or public sector companies and actually privatising them, so putting them into the private sector, selling shares and share issues, etc., in order to bring some of the advantages to the free market into what might have been previously monopoly-based market structures. Okay, so that's something we'll look at in a bit more detail in a minute. Another thing that happens is that natural monopolies don't have it all their own way. They are also regulated at times. So when it's in the public interest to just have one organisation providing some sort of public sector service or some sort of service to consumers, in some cases, again, we don't want the monopoly position that they're in to be exploited, and so there are a number of different ways in which natural monopolies can be regulated. And they're all about really protecting consumers, making sure that there is efficiency in the way in which the monopoly acts, maybe trying to encourage some innovation, all the things that would normally not be done in monopolies because of the strong market position and monopoly power that they hold. We're also going to look at the work on the Competition and Markets Authority. That's really talking about things like mergers and takeovers, but they also offer a range of other services. And also take a look at the impact of EU competition policy. Now, clearly, as we come out of Brexit, that may not necessarily have the same impact that it had previously, but for the moment, we need to assume that that situation still exists, and there is still going to be some impacts of the EU competition policy on business regulation. And in other instances, why businesses need to be regulated is again to protect employees. So making sure that organisations actually do have decent health and safety policies and they do meet legislation in order to make sure that employees are safe. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to be covering. First things first then, promoting competition. A number of ways in which the economy and specifically the government might choose to improve the scenario in certain markets. And competition policy is basically about improving competition within markets for all the benefits that customers receive, like better choice, lower prices, and also to some degree where you've got competition, maybe businesses are going to be more innovative and going to try and differentiate what they do for a market, and that clearly is going to give greater choice and hopefully greater satisfaction to consumers. And you could argue that if in the fight to try and achieve the best allocation of resources, one could argue that making sure that you're producing goods and services that are going to be sold and wanted by individuals, that clearly is also considered to be a way of making sure that you're allocating resources better. In some instances, this whole process of promoting competition is about trying to reduce or alleviate market failure in order specifically to protect the interests of consumers, to make sure that consumers are getting the most utility, maximising the utility and getting the most welfare for themselves and for society as a whole. And achieved by a number of different activities. Okay, one is to curtail or reduce monopoly power, and also protecting competitive markets. So, if we're in a situation where you've got an organisation who has significant market power, is a dominant monopoly, or even maybe a pure monopoly, in some cases, this promotion of competition will actually provide a healthy environment for those monopolies to actually think about what they're doing and not necessarily create the disadvantages that some monopolies can create, like lack of choice, high prices, exploiting their market position. Can also be done by restricting mergers. We talked about the Competition and Markets Authority. We'll come back and look at those in a bit more detail in a minute. And also prohibiting cartels, where we've got this situation where we've got in oligopolistic markets either over or tacit collusion and cartels where basically output levels of output and or prices are being manipulated to suit the organisation rather than the individual, so essentially exploiting customers. Also, the ways in which promoting competition can help, well, clearly in some cases it can help the way in which markets work. It might provide greater information, and also that allows consumers to make better choices. If you're in a situation where you've got all the information at your fingertips, you're likely to make a better, more reasoned decision. In essence, what it's trying to do is to create fairness within markets for both firms and consumers, so that the firms don't abuse their dominant position. Clearly, we know that organisations, in order to keep going, they need to be able to make acceptable profits in order to innovate and to increase productivity. But if they're actually using that dominant position and exploiting it in an unfair way, then that's where promoting competition and to some degree government intervention might come in. The other thing that we can look at is contestable market theory, and that can also be used to illustrate competition policy. So remember what we talked about in the previous couple of presentations, where we looked at what a contestable market was and what that signifies. So if a market is non-contestable, i.e. there's high barriers to entry, and some of the other features that we've looked at in terms of contestable markets, well, in some cases the competition policy will be used to try to make markets more contestable, okay, so that organisations can't take advantage of their dominant position within a market. And if we can achieve that, and if competition can do anything, it should help to get us back to somewhere near, or well, not as close as we can get to perfectly competitive markets, where we're hopefully going to improve our productive, allocative, static, and dynamic efficiency. Now, productive and allocative efficiency we talked about before. Static and dynamic efficiency, not so much, but basically, if we're talking about dynamic efficiency in particular, we're talking about using the profits that an organisation might make to drive innovation and productivity, and that essentially is going to then improve levels of productivity, maybe the efficient way in which the resources are being used, and also that's going to drive the market forward in terms of best practice. So let's have a look at the benefits then of competition policy. There are a number, and these include lower prices. Clearly, if you increase competition, that's going to cause a shift in the supply curve to the right, i.e. there's going to be more people willing to supply goods and services, and that will cause a fall in market price. So that's clearly a benefit to consumers. Should also, thinking about some of the things we talked about, if you're in a competitive situation, in order to maintain your customer base and your the level of sales that you're going to achieve, you're going to have to keep thinking, right, what can we do to make our products better? How can we make sure our customer service is going to be right at the top of the shop? Because if you don't, then you're likely to lose market share. So this threat of competition should actually improve the quality of goods and services and also customer service. Clearly, it's going to increase choice. We talked about this already. Because you've got a larger range of products and services, that should lead to an improved allocation of resources. And the reason for that is that the firms that are in a competitive environment are more likely to want to produce products that a variety of customers will wish to buy. So again, that sort of makes sense that the increased choice is also going to improve eventually or consequently the allocation of resources. Innovation will definitely be improved, and that's because we're going to get a more productive and allocatively efficient arrangement in our markets, where firms might choose to invest in R&D. They might look to improve their production processes to lower cost, and over time probably develop new products and services which are going to be more suited to their customers, and hopefully again that by its very nature will improve productive and allocative efficiency, and we won't be producing stuff that people don't want. So that would essentially be a waste of resources. So we're attempting to allocate resources in the most efficient way. That's clearly going to benefit society as a whole, isn't it? Because if we get those improvements in one particular industry, that should be able to be used across a whole range of markets. And you think about technology and technological change and using more capital equipment, but also improving the way in which we might actually be able to produce goods and services with decent training of labour. That clearly is going to make a big difference. And obviously, not only is it good for customers and for reducing the issues around market failure in terms of allocating resources, but it's also going to lead to on the wider scale, on the bigger stage, competitive advantage. Okay, and that could be both within the UK and EU if we're actually producing at a leaner, more cost-efficient way, and that clearly is also going to hopefully benefit the fact that we understand and ask our customers what they want before we start producing stuff, and that should put us in on a good footing to actually become more internationally competitive. And so not only are we talking about the competition policy being good for individual firms and individual customers within an environment, within an economy, we're talking about that on a grander global international stage too. Okay, so lots of benefits of competition policy. Let's take a look at how we might then prevent anti-competitive practices then. And what are they in the first instance? They are things that are designed to try to reduce competition in a market. So more often than not, they will be used by organisations to try for them to be able to exploit their dominant market position. Things that they could include, things like pricing strategies such as limit pricing or price fixing, so that effectively there is a level at which organisations might price, which is going to discourage people to come into the market, which is limit pricing, and also price fixing, where effectively we might, in some sort of form of collusive arrangement, fix a price to suit us rather than suit our consumers or customers. Other things they can include could include dumping of stock in markets at a loss to try to destroy competition. That happens quite a lot. And obviously in that situation, effectively, if you're doing that, if you're selling your goods at a loss, then there's highly likely that the competitors that are trying to actually move into a market are not going to be able to compete at that particular price. Can also be bundling of products, so consumers feel they have to buy accessories that they don't want to. And in some cases, obviously, there are lots of examples of businesses that will bundle products or say, well, this is going to work best if you have another version of this particular computer manufacturer's goods or services. So there is an element of that too, which is a slightly more subtle way of going about it, but again, might not necessarily be in the public interest. May also include exclusivity deals, so that buyers can only purchase from their contracted supplier, and the contracted supplier clearly is going to benefit from that, not necessarily going to benefit the buyer or the end user or the end buyer in that situation because of this issue. Okay. Next thing we're going to look at then, and we haven't mentioned this before, controlling mergers and takeovers. So this essentially is there to try to stop any sort of monopoly power or dominant monopoly being created by a merger or a takeover. Okay, now there are arguments for intervention and arguments against intervention, and they're listed on the slide that we just talked about, or that we just mentioned. Clearly there are some arguments for intervention. So if you're talking about a merger where two businesses are going to come together, say like the Sainsbury's and Asda merger, or in some cases a takeover where one organisation will literally take over another. So the very current example at the moment is Boohoo buying Debenhams. Well, they're not really buying Debenhams as a company. They're not buying any of the stores. They're buying their name and also their web details and their website. But in that instance, then if we're talking about arguments for intervention, in some cases it might protect jobs. It certainly could protect the consumer. More often than not, this exploitation of monopoly power is a bit of an issue, and also it should encourage greater choice. So if where we intervene and say no, this merger isn't in the public interest, then obviously that's clearly an important principle. In some instances, it may be that that's going to protect jobs or support UK-owned industries, and it also might protect our overall GDP, although you could argue it's a bit of a short-term measure in one sense, in that trying to control mergers and takeovers is not necessarily is seen as quite an interventionist process. Okay. Other things like British ownership and international pride, loss of identity and protecting IP are all arguments for intervening in certain scenarios. However, one could argue, and this probably comes more from a free market perspective than anything else, that arguments against intervention are to do with competitiveness. So it's the survival of the fittest. Things change, businesses change. Maybe those that are most efficient should be not actually hamstrung by not being able to take over other organisations which maybe aren't quite so efficient. We've got foreign direct investment, which obviously in some cases might create jobs. We may well actually also, thinking about strategic interests, we might choose to defence may be an important principle. So in some cases maybe an organisations coming together to actually create a better defence solution. In this case, maybe that might be a good reason to look at mergers and takeovers in a positive light. But also, can other countries do a better job? Thinking about comparative advantage and the opportunity cost principle. Maybe if we want to look at the overall allocation of resources in world markets, maybe that there is an argument for that too. Okay, let's take a look at privatisation. We mentioned privatisation right at the start of the PowerPoint, where we looked at some examples of different businesses that have been privatised. And again, there's arguments for and arguments against privatisation. And in essence, what it is, it's transferring of assets from government to privately owned businesses. And there's been a range since the 70s. It became very much an in vogue thing to do, particularly for Thatcher's Tory government, where they were privatising all sorts of things. And it still happens occasionally now. And there are some good arguments for, but also there are some significant ones against privatisation. Okay. So one of the issues is that when you privatise, particularly more often than not, some of these government-owned businesses were previously monopolies or have very significant dominant monopoly power. And clearly the argument against monopolies is that they're not particularly productively efficient. Okay, haven't necessarily got the profit motive to make sure that they cut their average costs. So one of the issues around privatisation is that it should bring greater productivity or productive efficiency, particularly as firms in the private sector are more likely to be motivated by profit. They'll be looking to profit maximise, and that's going to lead to them cutting average costs, long run average costs. There is also the argument to say that, again, as soon as you get into a situation where businesses are trying to create profits and trying to develop market share, they're going to need to satisfy their customer needs more closely. And that clearly is then going to generate more innovation and lead to dynamic efficiency. So cost savings, but also maybe new, innovative, different products that maybe wouldn't have been produced by the government-owned organisation. Also can argue again that allocative efficiency is much more important, where we're talking about goods and services that are produced to meet the needs of consumers. And that clearly is going to improve in a privatisation scenario. Other advantages as far as customers are concerned, well, clearly greater choice and lower prices, which to some degree is one of the main benefits of privatisation, bringing in competition. And again, in a situation where you had a previously publicly owned organisation, and maybe they were in a position where they did have monopoly power and were effectively achieving supernormal profits. Well, as soon as you bring in competition, then effectively supernormal profits will actually be competed away. Clearly, greater and increased competition rather than government monopoly leads to greater economic efficiency as well, for all of the reasons that we talked about previously. And in terms of the other advantages, as far as government is concerned, the revenue that they generate by selling off state assets is, and also the expenditure they've had to use to support some of those industries is going to fall. So you could argue that the government is then going to be generating or have more resources at its disposal to improve other parts of the economy. Okay, so we talked about, in this instance, privatisation. Just finished talking about privatisation, but in some instances, there are still these natural monopolies that exist where only one firm's in the market, and in this scenario, that is an important thing to consider. So the water industry is an example, and other ways in which these natural monopolies should be regulated. Okay, so effectively, a natural monopoly is where you've got one producer in an industry. Barriers to entry are too high, or so high that businesses that without business regulation, the consumer would face considerable exploitation. Okay, and also where the barriers to entry is so high, then effectively there is no point in making other organisations spend lots and lots of money in a scenario where to get into that market, which is then going to mean they can't actually achieve any sort of profit at all. So in this situation, clearly a monopolist with market power might actually use that position to charge high prices and also make abnormal profits, which clearly isn't in the public interest. That's also going to mean that's going to be allocatively inefficient, and there's going to be a misallocation of resources, because effectively in that scenario, The business is going to be quite happy. They're going to be charging high prices, but that's not really going to be achieving allocative efficiency, where we're attempting to maximize customer utility in addition to meeting the needs and requirements of a business. So there's an argument to say that where we have a monopoly, even a natural monopoly, where there are reasons why we might choose to use that, there is a danger that creates market failure. Clearly, for the reasons we talked about before, that the monopolies might be able to exploit consumers, charging higher prices, and so as a result of that, the government regulates in a fairly significant way the ways in which the monopolies run in order to protect consumers and customers. So in terms of protecting consumers then, let's take a look at how that can be done. A number of different ways. One is consumer protection laws, so protecting the consumer from firms with regard to quality of goods and services sold. And one of the issues is that big businesses are more powerful than individual consumers. And so one of the things that the legislation is attempting to do is to stop consumers from being exploited, which is pretty much what we've just discussed, isn't it? Okay, becoming more and more important, because as we get more technologically advanced products, sometimes it's quite difficult for customers to understand the whys and wherefores, and there might be some asymmetric information. Market for lemons being a thought process where effectively, in this case, the large organisation has more information about the product and service and may actually withhold some of that information from the buyer, and that clearly is then going to be a situation where they might be exploited. Pressurized selling techniques, clearly as businesses become more and more focused on profit and trying to achieve targets, etc., that can sometimes lead to pressurized selling techniques, which again may not necessarily be in the interest of consumers. And as we get more globalization and we get a wider spread of organizations that we're working with in different parts of the world and different parts of the economic communities that we work in, clearly some of their legislation might be different from ours, and again we want to make sure that we protect our consumers from those situations. Okay, so examples of how we might protect consumers then, a whole range of different acts of parliament and legislation which essentially is saying how you must work. Okay, now the first one that we've got listed there, consumer protection laws, includes number one, Consumer Rights Act. It used to be the Sale of Goods Act, but basically that was repealed in 2015 and became the Consumer Rights Act. And basically goods must be as described, they should be fit for the purpose, and they should be of merchantable quality. If they are not, then consumers have the right to actually say, this isn't right, I either want a replacement or I want my money back, and so that's designed to protect consumer rights. Trade Descriptions Act, which was first created in 1968, is where, again, goods must be exactly as described. The description can't be misleading in any way, and if it is, and it's proven to be the case, then the consumer is able to sue the company for misrepresentation and a number of other things too. Okay, the last one, and there are a range of others too, but Consumer Protection Act of 1987, where effectively businesses are liable for any costs incurred as a result of faulty or damaged goods, and prices quoted must be correct and not misleading. So all of those examples designed to try to protect consumers and consumer rights, and give us as individual consumers a little bit more protection from some of the big organisations who might be attempting to exploit their market position. Let's have a look at the CMA then, the Competition and Markets Authority. It's not the Country Music Awards, it's actually the Competition and Markets Authority. But basically there is a short video that you can take a look at, which you can click on, and also a little bit about what they do. So it's about really attempting to improve competition, okay, and not allow competition or markets to dictate too much what goes on in certain situations. Okay, so the CMA used to be the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, but it was the Monopolies and Mergers Commission became the Competition and Markets Authority in 2014, and it was all about promoting competition for the benefit of consumers. Took over from the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. Sort of they sort of came together, and also what do they do? They look at mergers, they look at markets where there seem to be monopoly power, and they will investigate and in some cases recommend that either a merger may not go ahead, or if a market has been seen to be controlled by a particular organisation, there are a number of measures that they can bring in to try to bring that organisation to heel, if you like. Also looks at anti-competitive practices that might lead to exploitation of customers and consumers. And there is a link also there for you to read more about what the CMA do. Other things to bear in mind, we've also got, in addition to all the UK-based stuff, in terms of CMA and all of the other things that the government is attempting to do to try and encourage and to regulate business. Regulations from the EU, yes, we may not be part of the EU for too much longer, but for a period of time we certainly will be. And the EU are particularly strong, and the European Commission are particularly strong on competition policy and anti-competitive behaviour within EU countries and its trading partners. Now, there are 3 examples that I've included there. One's an article and 2 are short video clips on the whole principle of how, in some cases, some large organisations have fallen foul. They've attempted to play some games in terms of the way they've set up their organisations in different parts of the world, and that has been to try to avoid to pay tax in certain scenarios, or not necessarily do things in the right way. Now, they may be legal, but whether they are in the true spirit of the law, then that's a very different story. Okay, so again, quite a big impact of EU competition policy on this whole area of business regulation. Other things that, in this case, the government might try to do as well. So we've talked very much about protecting consumers, also protecting employees. Very important that employee rights are safeguarded in the workplace. A number of different options that have been introduced ranging from the Equal Pay Act, where both sexes should be treated equally at work. And the fact that we've still got a gender pay gap might suggest that that's not quite working at the moment. Sex Discrimination Act, again, outlawing discrimination based on gender for recruitment, promotion, training or dismissal. The Race Relations Act, again, it's illegal to discriminate based on colour. Disability Discrimination Act, Working Time Regs, and also the National Minimum Wage Act, where, again, designed to try to defend employees and protect employees from being exploited. The National Minimum Wage only came in 1999, and that effectively is guaranteeing a minimum hourly wage that's introduced across the UK, and that's constantly being looked at and considered by organisations and governments too, to try to come up with the right way to actually ensure that individuals get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and also to try and address some issues around relative poverty and trying to bring people out of poverty into a situation where they're on a living wage. Other things which actually are relevant to employee protection, but in this case we're talking about the rights in the workplace, and these include a range of things from where we're talking about groups of employees like trade unions, for instance. So the Employment Act, which was brought in recently, meant that secondary picketing was outlawed. The Trade Union Act, so a number of these Reform Acts and Employee Relations Acts are about, in this case, probably if you look at each one of those, it's about actually reducing the power of the trade union. Okay, now one could argue that employee protection and the way in which trade unions work is very much in the interest of their individual needs, but sometimes they maybe not necessarily in the interest of the employer. Now, again, I'm not making a political point here, but in this instance, obviously, it's quite an important balancing act, because one could argue that if we over-regulate in a certain situation, some businesses may choose not to employ as many people, and or they may not necessarily want to set up in our country as opposed to other countries where maybe employee protection is not quite as onerous a process for them. So it is a delicate balancing act between making sure that we actually do employ, do protect employees and protect their rights, but actually not make it so difficult for businesses to develop and grow on that basis. So those are the areas we've looked at. Okay, we've looked at promoting competition through a range of different measures, from preventing anti-competitive practices through to privatisation. We've also looked at regulation of natural monopolies, how we might protect consumers, how the CMA works, and also employee protection. So that's a range of items that we've covered. Obviously, your chapter 7 in your booklets from page 35 through to page 40 rather, also gives some valuable insights that you might want to take a look at. So thank you for listening once more. The next chapter we're going to be looking at, which we'll be looking at later on this week, is how much regulation. Now, we've sort of already touched on that, but we'll look at that in a bit more detail. How far do we have to go? How far should we go? And what are the costs, some of the costs of regulation? But that's something for the next time round. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch up soon in our live tutorial, which will be later on in the week, next week. Okay, thank you.